everybody. I'm back and you're back, and it's good to see everyone again. This is Jacque at Stitch House in Plano, Texas, and we're ready to do a series of videos on binding. And we're going to take it real slow. I want you to work along with me. You'll have homework to do after each of the 5 videos. We'll start with squaring up our quilts because that's important. We'll go into cutting the binding and joining the strips of binding. Backing up a minute, we'll even look at how to determine how much binding you need and how many strips you need to cut. We'll look at a couple of ways to cut accurately, cut those strips accurately. We'll look at pressing and sewing the binding on. And a very important feature, we'll be looking at mitering the corners. Mitered corners, nice mitered corners on a quilt are so important. We'll look at how to join the binding at your starting and stopping place. We'll look at a couple of ways to do that because sometimes you have just a short end. You might be putting binding on a pot holder or a cup mat, and you want to know how to join your end pieces there too. And then we'll look at some novelty bindings, a padded flange binding and a mini piping binding. So that'll be over the course of about 4 weeks, 5 weeks actually. So stay with me, we'll go slow, you'll be able to do everything. And let me tell you one more thing, none of my work will be done by hand. So I do bindings completely by machine. You can adapt some of my techniques if you like to do handwork, but I don't do handwork, so I'll be showing you how to sew your binding entirely by machine. All right, looking forward to this. We'll get started right away. Okay, so now we're getting ready to sew the binding to our quilt or quilt sample, what I have here. And one of the techniques that I'll be showing you further on is using this binding tool to join the ends of the binding. And in order to use this binding tool, you need to leave a 12-inch, an exactly 12-inch opening along one side. So obviously I can't do that along the short side. I'll be measuring my 12 inches along the long side. And I don't want to measure from the corner, but I want to come in from the corner a little ways and measure 12 inches. I would normally mark with a fabric marker, but because I want you to see exactly what I'm doing, I am going to make my mark rather bold. Obviously I won't be hanging this quilt, this sample, on a wall anywhere. Alright, so there's my 12 inches, and again it needs to be accurately 12 inches there. Now, full disclosure time. I don't do handwork. So, my binding is going to be sewn to the wrong side. This is the right side of my quilt. I'm going to be sewing my binding to the wrong side of the quilt because I bring my binding around to the right side, and I'll give you some options on how to secure it on the right side. If you like to do handwork, you may be sewing your binding to the right side and then bringing your binding around to the wrong side. But again, you're talking to someone here, you're listening to someone who does not do handwork. I said yesterday to someone, as soon as I learned that buttons could be sewn on by machine, I was through with buttons that have a shank built onto them. So I have found ways to work around sewing by machine, and that's what we're going to do here. All right, so I have a nice extension of binding past my beginning point. And where should you begin? That's a good question. On a quilt, the eye tends to go to the top of the quilt first. So always start your binding along a bottom edge, or if the bottom edge is too narrow, then maybe a quarter up from one side. But don't start your binding at the top, even though your binding will be perfect, finished off when I show you this. All right, so I'm aligning my folded binding, cut edges of it, with my serged edge, and I actually am going to put a little pin in there so I can see where that mark is, because I don't really want to go past that. And I'm using my walking foot, and I highly recommend that you use a walking foot for sewing binding on. And why is that? If you have dual feed on your machine, dual feed is designed to guide 2 layers of fabric evenly through the machine. But if you have multiple layers of fabric, including batting, then a walking foot is the best bet for keeping things nice and even as you sew. All right, so I'm going to back stitch to my starting point, and then I'm coming forward. Do you know on most walking feet there is a guide that you can use for sewing a 1/4 inch seam? So on the front of this foot is a little notch, and I'm guiding that notch to the edge of the fabric. So all I have to do is align my fabric, binding and fabric edge, and sew, watching that guiding point. Again, if I watch the needle go up and down, I'm probably going to have some very unusual seam widths here. Certainly not the consistency that I can get by watching the guiding point on the presser foot. Now, when you get about 2 inches from the corner, you want to stop. And actually, we should have the needle stopping down in the fabric. Yes. Take another stitch and get that needle down. All right, now I'm going to make a diagonal fold like so. So there's a little fold right here, and I want to be sure that this new side of my quilt is aligned with the cut edges of my binding that's folded out to you're seeing your left, it's my right side. And then I'm going to take my Rolly gizmo and press a little crease in there. Then I'm going to unfold that. Now, why did I do that? Most instructions say to sew and stop a 1/4 inch from the corner. But if your seam allowance is any different from a 1/4 inch, then you're not being accurate on your stopping point. The stopping point actually should be the distance from the corner equaling the width of your seam allowance, which is a 1/4 inch most times. But if you do it like this, make the crease and then take, it would be a fabric marker normally, and make a little line in that crease, and just do that line where your needle, in line with your needle, and sew up to that line, again watching the guiding point on your presser foot. And I'm slowing down now to take just 1 stitch at a time. All right, so then I've stopped right on that diagonal line that I drew, and I'm going to back stitch. And just 2 or 3 stitches is all you need. And I'm going to cut the thread. Oop, cut the thread. Click the wrong button there. All right, so you can see over here the line that I drew, and I stopped exactly at that line, and then I back stitch. All right, then I'm going to refold, and here you can see how that first fold was, so that I folded like so, and my binding was aligned with this side, and that's how I determined the fold here and that little crease line. All right, now I'm going to bring my binding back over the diagonal fold and lay it along the second side. And I want this fold of fabric, the fold right up here, to be in line with my first edge of fabric. Now, I don't want to have any extra fabric sticking out here. I want everything to be perfectly aligned. I would be very careful not to have extra fold of fabric past my first side. I want to be right on that. So I'm going to bring it back so I can see it. Yes, that looks good. I'm going to place this back under the presser foot, and I'm going to take a couple of back stitches to secure, and then come forward. Alright, Once again, I'm approaching a corner. I want to stop about 2 inches from the corner, and I'm going to make the diagonal fold in the binding, aligning the cut edges of the binding with the cut edge of this second side. And I'm going to take my rolly and crease that. And you want to be sure that crease is coming directly from the corner. And again, use a fabric marker. Do as I say, not as I do here. And mark that line. And then you'll sew to that line. So I'm going to stop right on that line and then backstitch. Cut my thread. Refold just as I did to create that diagonal fold, and then fold my binding back towards the new side. I want to be sure that the fold here on the binding is not past that cut edge. And be sure that these two cut edges are aligned and that my cut edge of the binding is aligned with my serged edge on my quilt, which for you may be a raw edge, in case you don't like my idea of serging that. All right, so now I'm going to backstitch to the corner. And come forward. I'm approaching another corner. So I'm going to stop back from the corner about 2 inches and then make that diagonal fold again, making the fold directly from the corner, being sure that the cut edges of the binding are aligned with the next side that I'm sewing. I'll use my rolly tool to crease that. And then, because I might have trouble seeing that crease when it gets under the presser foot, I'm going to draw a line on that crease with a fabric marker normally. And then I'm going to sew right up to that line. So one more stitch will do it. There we go. And then back stitch a few stitches. Cut my thread. Okay. All right, then I can refold and bring the binding along my new side. I want to be sure that the fold that I make on the binding here is not over the cut edge of the fabric. I want to be sure these edges are aligned, and I want to be sure my edges are aligned along the new side. Place that under the presser foot and I'll backstitch. And then sew forward. Approaching a corner, so I'm going to stop a couple inches away from the corner, make the diagonal fold exactly from the corner, crease with my rolly tool, mark the crease on the inside in just the area where I need to sew. So right up to that crease and then backstitch. That one should do it. Yeah, now let's backstitch and cut the thread. That was the fold I made to make the crease line. Fold my binding over so that I have a fold here along the side I was sewing on. And the binding is now aligned with the next side that I need to sew. I want to be sure these edges are aligned nicely. Then I can turn my fabric. And this is the side that I started sewing on, so I'm going to be sure I know where that point is. Oops, I didn't get that quite aligned right. All right, I'm going to back stitch a little bit and then come forward. All right, so here's the point that I do not want to sew past because I must leave a 12-inch opening on this binding in order to use the tool that I like to use. Now, I would suggest that you remeasure this 12 inches and be sure you have exactly 12 inches because that'll be important when we're ready to connect up these pieces of binding. If you need to make any adjustment, taking another stitch or two on one end or the other, you can do that at this time, but not later. Now, we're not going to go any further in this segment, but if you have made your corners properly, you will see how beautifully that mitered corner is. And you'll be able to make that same miter on the other side, whether you've sewn your binding to the wrong side as I have, or you've sewn it to the right side. I do at this point, well, at some point I like to do a little pressing, and you could even use your rolly tool to press the binding away from the quilt. I'm not quite ready to show you how to finish this up, but I would suggest on your sample or on your quilt that you go ahead and get this ready by pressing the binding away. You can use your iron if you like, or you can use the rolly tool. All right, so you've got some homework to do. You've got to cut your binding, you've got to sew the ends together, you need to sew the binding to the four corners of your quilt or sample, whichever you're doing. And then you need to press the binding away from the quilt. Don't do any pressing in this area where you've left the binding open. Actually, I need to show you one other thing, but not on this sample, so let me get another sample out and we'll look at how to work if you don't have a 12-inch opening, okay? But look, isn't that going to look nice when that comes around? Nice mitered corner there, and then we'll make it miter real nicely on this side too. It'll be perfect. One of the first things I look at on quilts is the corner mitered. And I don't think it's difficult to do, and I don't want it to be difficult for you. So I'm hoping you will run your samples of this and become comfortable with doing mitered corners on your quilts. It really enhances your quilts. Okay, so let me get another piece ready and then we'll sew again. Sometimes you're doing a quilt that's too small to leave that 12-inch opening, and so we want to know another way to finish the ends of the quilt. And that's what we're going to start right now. So you would have a piece of binding and you want to be sure that you have a 45-degree angle cut on it. Like so. All right. And then most instructions will tell you to fold back 1/4 of an inch, but I am telling you, if this were going to be a hot pad and it gets laundered a lot, I have seen that little scant 1/4 inch come out in the laundry. So I would fold back at least a 1/2 inch and maybe even a little bit more. And you'll want to press that in place. And then you can trim away. You've got some pretty substantial dog ears there. You can trim those away. All right. Now, on the side that you start, you're going to have your binding open, and you're going to be sewing it to the wrong side if you don't plan to do handwork, which I don't. And you want to sew the 1/4 inch seam. And sew that 1/4 inch seam for, maybe 1.5 to 2 inches. All right, and then you can raise your needle up and fold the fabric over like so, and then you're going to come back and begin picking up sewing about where you left off. So the starting is a little bit different. The corners are exactly the same, so you won't be doing anything different on the corners, and you don't need to watch me do 4 corners, so I'm going to stop the video right here. You have homework to do. You've got a couple, you know what? Let's not do this one yet because I have a different binding I want to show you and you may want to put on it. But let's get this sample or a quilt to the point of having the 10-inch tails and the 12-inch opening. So your 4 corners will be mitered. You're ready for that for the next lesson.